Good afternoon from Queen's School of Business. My name is Neil Bierce. I'll be moderating today's session. Our topic today is Emerging International Security Risks and the Impact on International Business. I want to handle a few of our housekeeping slides before we get started. The first is that many people often will send me a note in the chat window asking how often we do these sessions and how people get invited. Sometimes people get an invitation from a colleague and they're not quite sure where the invitation originated from originally. And I can tell you that if you go to qsb.ca/webinars, you can sign up to receive these monthly invitations to your own inbox, completely free of charge, and we do run these sessions monthly on a variety of business topics. We already have next month's session lined up, and it's going to be all about loyalty programs in business. So if you don't want to miss that one, please make sure to register at qsb.ca/webinars. Secondly, our most frequently asked question is, will this be recorded and how can I get the recording? We do record all of our webinars, and we will send an email out to everyone who registered for today's event. It's important to note that if you get an invitation to a future event and you're unable to attend, please register anyway. It's not like you're taking someone else's seat. And then after the event is over, we'll send you the recording, which you can watch anytime at your leisure. You can also check out qsbinsight.com, and that's a website where we host and house all of our previously recorded webinars. So if you have nothing to do this afternoon, you have hours of business-related entertainment there. Next up, questions and answers. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation at any time. We're going to answer the questions in the 15 minutes at the end of the session, but as moderator, I can tell you it is very difficult to triage through 100 questions if they all come in at the very last minute. So don't be afraid to send a question through at the moment that it strikes you. I'll make a note of it and pass it across the table to our presenter, and we'll get to those, as many as we can, at the end of the session. If you would like to tweet about today's event, first of all, you can follow us at QSBinsight on Twitter, and secondly, you can use the hashtag QSBwebinar to share any of the salient points with any of your friends and followers. Now I'd like to introduce today's session leader, Dr. Ann Fitzgerald. She is a professor of management and security at Cranfield University and a visiting professor here at Queen's School of Business. As well, she is director of Cranfield Center for Security Sector Management. She holds degrees in commerce, international relations, war studies, and security and defense management. She currently serves on the boards for the Institute for Research on Public Policy, Safer World, the Canadian International Council, and the Security Sector Advisory Group for UK Trade and Investment. She also chairs the International Working Group on National Security. Since joining Cranfield's faculty in 2001, Ann has served as Associate Dean of Research and led Cranfield's Center for Security Sector Management for the past 8 years. She is also course director for the Master's Program in Security Sector Management that is delivered both in the UK and in Ethiopia. She's widely published on issues concerning international security intervention, strategic planning for national security, and the role of non-state actors in promoting national stability and growth. She has advised the governments of a number of post-conflict and developing countries, including Lebanon, Ethiopia, Haiti, Indonesia, Nepal, Botswana, and Sierra Leone, on issues relating to national security policy and strategic issues. In 2011, she was appointed by the United Nations and the African Union's High Implementation Panel as facilitator for post-referendum peace talks between North and South Sudan. In recognition for her considerable achievements in the field of global security, she was awarded Queen Elizabeth II's Diamond Jubilee Medal in December. So with that, I'm going to pass the controls across the table. I wish you all a very insightful session, and I'll be back for the Q&A. If you do have any technical questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to send me a message, and I'll do my best to get you back on the road. And with that.
Great. Thank you very much, Neil, and hello to everybody out there. It's a great shame that I can't see you all, but I hope this will be as interactive as it can be. Please do send your questions along the way so I can hopefully attend to most of them at the end. Delighted to be here today and really pleased to be speaking with you about this interesting issue, the emergence of international security with international business and how the two impact on each other. I have set out a few objectives for this short 45-minute session, and I'll underscore 45 minutes because it's a time limit that I intend to stick to. because I'd like to open the floor up to the greatest extent possible for questions at the end. I'd like to overview contemporary meanings of the concept of security. It's a very contested subject and a term that has evolved greatly over the years. I'd like to understand some critical emerging global security risks, how such trends and risks can impact on the operations and activities of international business, and lastly, to provide some considerations for global market development and penetration strategies. I'm also going to try to achieve two general objectives. The first is to recognize that many of the listeners out there are from not only the global private sector, but the public sector and the not-for-profit sector. And so whilst I cannot cater wholly to one of those areas, I'm going to try to spread my pitch so it gives everybody in each of those sectors something to take home. The second thing I'd like to do is to drill down. And by that, I mean to not be repetitious about the issues that are flagged up to us by the news media, but actually to look at a number of different international security issues and how they interdepend on each other and interrelate to each other and how they manifest into broader themes. So I'm hopefully going to go beyond the cybersecurity terrorist threats, the independently considered security threats, and look at some areas of convergence of all those threats. I won't be exhaustive in my analysis, but I will highlight 5 areas that hopefully will provide you with some takeaways. Let's start by talking about security and the term of reference itself. It is an ambiguous concept. It very much depends on the lens through which one understands and comes to the debate with. So it's very multidisciplinary in nature. Generally speaking, most definitions refer to the protection of people, assets, and societies from ongoing and emerging threats. And most of the definitions have been threat-based and described as such by many scholars and analysts. But many of the definitions of national security really underscore the issue of a country's values and interests and what encroaches on those values and interests. But I've thrown this definition up on the screen because, again, I'd like to pitch this to a multi-sectoral audience and not just a public sector audience. Many different subsets of security have also developed, and I've listed a number of those down in the second half of this slide. And again, depending on what disciplinary background, experiential background you come to the debate with, some groups might relate more to cybersecurity aspects, others to political security, some to national security and the inviolability of borders and territorial sovereignty. Engineers may be very concerned with physical and infrastructural security of countries. Environmental security has emerged as a huge area and going beyond issues related to climate change, but niching out into areas such as water security. We've seen some frosty relations develop amongst the riparian state governments along the Nile. Issues over who owns what proportion of the Nile River resources, who has a say in what those resources will be used for. There's an interest in some countries for those resources to be used for irrigation purposes, in other countries for the generation of power and energy to be sold off to neighboring states. So this is leading to increased vulnerabilities due to water security and water insecurity. Food insecurity as well, and this is closely related to climate change, but is emerging as a subject in its own right. Broader debate on human security and security not just of states and their surrounding borders, but security of the individual person as well, particularly in countries where there is a distinction drawn between national security and regime security, that national security often is interpreted by government political elites as the security of the regime and not the security of the people. Human security caters for the individual person and promotes internal safety and security as well as external security of a state's borders. Social security is an area that has been written about extensively as well. We've seen the United States battle with challenges to healthcare policy over the last couple of administrations. Countries like Canada and Germany see huge opportunities, but also risk and vulnerabilities in fairly liberal immigration policies and the need for those areas of social security to be managed. Indeed, in some countries that in the past have undergone civil conflict and civil strife, we have seen lost generations which haven't had access to education assume leadership positions, not only in government, but across the business community, and countries adjusting their priority policy areas to cater for that vulnerability or insecurity. So many different subsets, and again, that list is not exhaustive, but a very multidisciplinary concept and very much dependent on what epistemic community one is coming from. I've developed a very simple schematic which I hope can serve the interests of all the different types of sectors represented in the classroom today. Whether you are a national government in a public sector department or in fact a commercial organization or an NGO, your organization has interests and values, and they sit at the apex of a organizational hierarchy. The second area of planning with that organization is to analyze a strategic environment, and you will recall in your past studies, particularly in the commerce area in the MBA, the need to assess the macro and the micro environment. And security is really featured in this area. It's a macro issue and it's a micro issue. From there, and once planners gauge the extent to which the strategic environment impacts on the values and interests of an organization, broader policy goals, strategic policy goals are developed. And these are usually few in number, but they set an organization's direction. And they have broader implications for those parts of the organization that sit underneath: strategic business units, departments, directorates, whatever they might be called. So security issues, risks, trends, and threats really help inform that strategic environmental analysis, both at the macro level and the micro level of all organizations. Now, this can also be linked to the change management area and the need to respond to transformational change in a measured and controlled way. And transformational change comes as a result of environmental change. And some of you might recognize this model that I've put up that hails from change management expert Kurt Lewin, who really makes the point that whilst organizations are pursuing incremental change in response to a changing environmental condition, at one change, the need for change is so transformational in nature that an organization can go into flux and either recover, catering for that transformational change, or in fact slide into demise, which is depicted by number 4 in the chart in front of you. So in summary, international security trends and the many different subsets and interdisciplinarity of these areas is important to monitor in order to stay abreast of environmental change in a manageable and controlled way. I want to bring your attention to the world map for a moment, and just to remind ourselves that all countries are countries in transition. All countries are in a state of transition. This is why many analysts, policymakers, academics refer to the transitioning state. More often than not, these transitions are driven by the need for change, the need for reform. And this need for reform is almost always driven by insecurities, vulnerabilities of different types, vulnerabilities that may make a state less resilient and unable, therefore, to withstand change and shock. So, for example, after the peso crisis in 1994 in Mexico, after the financial crisis in Argentina in 2007, these two countries pursued aggressive economic reforms, and their state of transition became based on their response to economic insecurities and economic vulnerabilities. Countries like Central and Eastern European countries, post-Berlin Wall falling in 1989, and perhaps also Indonesia at the end of 1998, following the fall of the Suharto regime, pursued aggressive political reform due to the political vulnerabilities and insecurities that existed in that transitory environment, or transitioning environment. You could also argue that the Arab Spring revolutions of 2009 called for the need for political change, and political reforms in most cases ensued thereafter. There are also social vulnerabilities and insecurities that exist. And I talked about this very briefly at the beginning of the presentation in terms of immigration policy, health policy, education policy. And then there are traditional national security threats, such as ongoing conflicts between South Sudan and Sudan, many of which are over oil and the oil reserves along the border between the two countries, the conflict in Syria, and the impact that this is having on a country like Lebanon, disputes in the Kashmir region, etc. So when we look across this world map and across the globe, it's important to open one's mind up to the ambiguous concept of security and insecurity, and recognize that states in transition are experiencing insecurities of different forms. And these insecurities and recognition of them require the prioritization of different policy instruments. So if a company or an organization is working in that country, it's very important to understand these vulnerabilities in order to understand the national agenda and the national priorities and where those policy instruments are being targeted. Another map that I'll just alert you to is the 2012 Fund for Peace Index. And that leaves you with a very worrying feeling. If you look at the way the different countries have been color-coded, bearing in mind that green is where we want to be. Green denotes sustainable stability, and dark green in particular. And lo and behold, there is one country in the world that maps out as dark green, and that is Finland. So very lovely to see Canada appearing as green, Australia, New Zealand, and the other Scandinavian countries, as well as Iceland, also appear in green. But look at the rest of the world. There are some pretty severe vulnerabilities that stretch in color from yellow all the way to red. And across that range is where the emerging opportunities are in the globe at the moment. And you even see the higher incidence of conflict in middle-income countries now, as opposed to low-income countries. And again, many of these middle-income countries are the countries that global business is targeting for international expansion. So I think that's a very compelling map, and one that we can link to the last slide about states in transition. We all have heard lots about the debate on globalization and how globalization is a process by which national and regional economies, societies, and cultures become integrated through the network of trade, communication, immigration, and transportation. And most of the work on globalization has highlighted both positive and negative aspects of this debate. But even still, nobody can afford to remain outside of the globalization equation. Therefore, when one looks at international security trends, I feel that it's very important to analyze these trends on the back of globalization issues. And that's another area of convergence that I think is underanalyzed and something that I'm seeking to do in this presentation. So the first theme I'd like to talk about in terms of the 5 themes being discussed today is economic liberalization and the liberalization of financial markets more broadly. And this refers to the loosening of global market restrictions on economic activity. This is one tool of globalization, so one of a number of globalization concepts. And I think it's important to remember that we in the West were the makers of globalization, so we are responsible primarily for these concepts that drive globalization. And when I think about economic liberalization, I think about the high number of companies that have identified the wealth opportunities in a country like Ethiopia, including Canadian mining and potash companies. And despite the rich opportunities in Ethiopia, Africa's fastest and certainly one of the world's fastest growing economies, the socialist Marxist political culture still sees single state providers for all main service provisions. So these markets are not liberalized, and even though they're participating in global trade and the global economy, there are some restrictions to what they can and cannot do according to the policies of their national government. And it's important for organizations working in those environments to find ways around these restrictions. And this is why you see a large number of Chinese companies operating in Africa, as well as Brazilian and Turkish companies. They're very comfortable with this model, and they recognize that global opportunities need not be driven by Western constructs of globalization. But of course, this issue plays out closer to home as well, with other countries paying lip service to free trade, in a country like France, for example, and other European countries as well, including Belgium. Whilst power and energy markets should, under EU legislation, be open, it's no secret that these sectors are predominantly state-owned. And when questioned about this, governments may claim that they have publicly floated under, well, a minute percentage of the sector as a way of becoming compliant with this legislation. But in many cases, these issues have not progressed from the apparent direction that they were heading in some time ago when this legislation was developed. The second theme I'd like to talk about is the non-state system of governance and non-state actors, because these formations have developed in a way that now, well, to a point where they exert considerable influence on society. Weak national state structures have over time empowered various forms of non-state systems of governance. Now, looking in the Canadian context, one could argue that even very developed states like Canada work with non-state actors such as the private sector and civil society. For example, countries like Britain and the United States have provisions for private health care, private education, private transportation, which are delivered by non-state actors, normally private sector actors. However, in these countries, there are rules and regulations guiding the norms, behaviors, and policies of these non-state actors, which makes their activity reasonably predictable and, at best, innovative. But in many other countries, weak state structures, as well as the lack of outreach of federal capital city-based governments to peripheral communities, results in alternative systems of governance emerging. And these systems of governance come in many different forms. At one end of the extreme, you can have militia groups, vigilante groups, led by warlords or terrorist group leaders. And these groups are not to be discounted, as their activities have been traced to be funded by sophisticated resource bases, which tap directly into formal finance and trading systems. But many of these groups work in the peripheral areas of countries, and often in areas where rich resource-related opportunities exist. So independence movements in the Caucasus region, militia groups operating along the South Sudanese border where the oil fields are, the Tuareg groups around the mines in West Africa, the Taliban in Afghanistan, the Ogaden National Liberation Front in Ethiopia, right around the area where there is unexploited oil and gas. All these provide examples of such non-state actors. And the support of the populations around these groups should also not be underestimated. Certainly in the case of groups like the Taliban, they provide populations with jobs, food, security, and education. They are therefore considered as legitimate actors by society. And different analysts would argue that Boko Haram in northern Nigeria would fall into this category as well. Elements of the FARC in Colombia fall into this area. Maoist insurgency leaders in Nepal, et cetera, et cetera. So these systems are perhaps more prolific than meets the eye. And don't forget, many borders across Africa and Asia, in particular, were drawn by their colonial masters, despite the fact that nations and the tribes, the ethnic groups, et cetera, that make up the nation straddle borders. It's a very transboundary issue. So these non-state systems of governance are, in the eyes of many, more credible and more inclusive than anything that the formal government can cater for. Some countries, such as Botswana, have given formal recognition to these systems through the creation of a paramount house of chiefs, et cetera, but this is the exception rather than the rule. Ghana is another African country that has developed a paramount house of chiefs. And some scholars would argue that this introduces a concept of two sets of trading borders. One border that is recognized by way of the formal state structures, and another border that is built around the nation as opposed to the state. I'm just turning to the next slide now, and I thought I'd just put up a few pictures of examples of different forms of non-state governance in a range of different countries. So the first one relates to an issue already discussed, warlord leaders, militia groups, terrorist groups, but those groups who are linked to very sophisticated networks and funding bases. The second picture to the right is a picture of a Don in Jamaica, a leader of an inner-city group in Kingston, Jamaica, a capital city, not part of the formal state government, but certainly considered as the leader of a certain district in Kingston, and as a result, someone who liaises directly with government and is seen as the spokesperson of that community. Just below the Jamaican Don is a group of Lebanese business leaders, and I always find Lebanon a fascinating place to work, and both in the private sector and the public sector. You see the sectarian bases of society really dictate opportunities for people. So, for example, there are three leading groups in Lebanon: Christian Maronites, Sunni, and Shia. If there is a position at the senior management level of an organization that has been traditionally held by a Christian Maronite, and the next Christian Maronite in line for that position is sitting at a middle management position, then you often see people springboard a chunk of the hierarchy to fill that role that is based on traditional society rather than formal state government processes. And the same could be said in some areas of Japanese society where the four-tier hierarchy with samurai lineage at the top of that hierarchy has provided opportunities for people in both the business community and in government. Moving on to the next slide. The first frame on the top left shows a Dutch company working in Eastern Africa, being briefed by the tribal elder in that region and learning about approaches to dispute resolution and land use and land tenure, because all of that is controlled by the traditional system in this particular East African area and not by the formal state system, even though there are formal rules and policies in this particular state. We've talked about the Taliban. The frame to the right of the Dutch company frame is a leading member of the Taliban. Underneath to the left side of the graph is a Nigerian tribal elder and his wife, very colorful attire. Hugely powerful in West Africa are the tribal elders. And again, people who need to be factored in as critical stakeholders for any organization operating outside of the urban centers. The last slide shows a Maoist leader known as Prachanda, who now has a formal position in the government of Nepal, but who before that led a lot of the guerrilla insurgency groups. And again, Maoism is a transboundary issue. So these Maoist groups are not cordoned off in Nepal only. There are Indo-Maoist groups and there are Chinese Maoist groups. And his role as a traditional leader of those communities will cater for those transboundary interests, despite the fact that he now has a formal position in government that should support the interests of the state, the formal state. And he's been applauded based on his reputation for catering for both heritages. The next slide talks about the global export trade. And the reason why I want to mention the global export trade is because globalization has sought to open up markets, to open up trading opportunities, and yet for many middle-income countries, and certainly low-income countries, the rigidity of the trade restrictions have been prohibitive for them to join the global export trade and have introduced many negative consequences. So let's use Haiti as an example, and a country that Canada has had a great interest in over the years since a conflict erupted in 1994, and due to the significant Haitian diaspora community here. Haiti is importing American sugar instead of its own sugar because of the rigidity of the trade restrictions. And this is not a good thing for promoting regional and global stability, because many countries make their money and government revenues from import taxes and trade tariffs. So we haven't seemed to move forward as well as we could do in that area. The Chinese have come in and helped countries develop their industrial policies to allow them to be more compliant with these trade regulations and restrictions. And one strategy that they have pursued is agglomeration. Another strategy that they have pursued is something called trade in tasks. So take cotton, for example. If you have a like-minded group of countries brought together to support a trade in tasks strategy, you would put one country responsible for gathering the cotton, one country responsible for batting, one country responsible for spinning, and one country responsible for weaving. So it breaks up the production process, but together makes for a powerful export trade and export opportunities. So there's more that some global companies are petitioning quite strongly with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris, which sets a lot of the legislation on trade policy. to ease trade restrictions. You see this also in sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, in terms of livestock and horticulture, and the inability for many of these countries to meet the phytosanitary regulations and standards imposed by the trade legislation. The fourth theme is a very interesting theme, and I've described it as the power of ideas in modern technology, and the recognition that powerful ideas have the ability to mobilize resources and shape national identity. And modern technology has only increased this ability to spread powerful ideas. And of course, the best ideas are optimized where there are good levels of regulation and freedom of debate and expression. So ideas can be discussed and debated in a considered way, and a pathway taken forward which is good for a society, good for a country. But of course, these high levels of regulation and freedom of debate and expression don't exist in all countries throughout the world. We've now seen how social networking has brought positive change to many societies. Some would argue that the Arab Spring serves as a good example of how technology-based networking has mobilized societies to promote democratic change. This technology has had not such a positive effect on other societies. So, in fact, even in the weakest low-income countries, all that an individual requires to make a mobile telephone work is a burned-out car battery. And I have seen communities in peripheral areas of countries hooking their mobile adapters up to burned-out car batteries in countries like Chad and some regions in Nigeria, in areas in Pakistan. This brings communication out to areas that have been deprived of communication in the past. And while internet connectivity may not reach some of these areas, the interactive mobile telephone has produced some powerful social change based on the ease of transmitting things like podcasts and sermons on podcasts through text messages. Indeed, such a phenomenon has been observed in countries such as Chad and regions in Nigeria where more moderate Islamic groups have been influenced by wider international networks of more extreme radical Islam. And this has, in some parts of the world, led to changes in social infrastructure. Powerful technology has also increased the incidence of money laundering. Here in Canada, banks now need to report to a body called FinTrack, which tracks illegal or suspicious deposits or withdrawals. And individual bankers are also now consumed with issues concerning illegal money wires and exercise extreme due diligence to ensure that it's actually the client making the request for a money wire and not another source. In addition, greater access to open source information and global trading stocks, so by that I mean a Canadian banker is able to buy stocks on the US, British, Tokyo exchanges as well as the Canadian exchange, has encouraged markets to exercise more scrutiny over insider trading. But having highlighted all these risks and vulnerabilities, the power of technology has also brought about many opportunities and positive innovations. For example, farmers in East African, Latin American, and South Asian countries can now be paid through mobile phone technology and smart cards, where local proprietors are sent a PIN number, which they then take to their local bank or remittance office, which subsequently pays them. Mobile telephone technology has also made some very impressive gains in the healthcare field, where smartphones have been used for the remote monitoring of people's health and the health of pregnant women, for example, particularly in areas far from the capital city, which are often cut off from the basic state services. So once again, these opportunities will only increase, particularly in the African continent, where the arrival of the underwater fiber optic cables in both Ghana on the west side and in Lamu, Kenya on the right side will offer up widespread internet connectivity, but also the risks as well as the opportunities will increase. And of course, all these developments beg the question of whether or not we have the right regulatory capacity or sufficient regulatory capacity to be compliant with all of these new regulations. There are no shortage of regulatory bodies and protocols and measures. Indeed, we have international regulation, international protocol, regional regulation and protocol. So in the Caribbean countries, the regional organization CARICOM exists. In Southeast Asia, the regional organization ASEAN exists. In Europe, European Union. In Africa, there are many different regional organizations, some more active than others, but overall there's the African Union. And then there's the national level too. So one would think that this three-tiered system of regulation would offer pretty good protection from these potentially dangerous trends. But actually it's down to a country's national government to enforce and be compliant with regulation. And if this can't happen, the regional regulatory frameworks and international regulatory frameworks really don't matter. One very good and compelling example of this is the calls from the International Criminal Court to hand over the Republic of Sudan's President Omar al-Bashir, and also Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta. And neither of these cases has been successful because the countries themselves and the societies themselves do not feel, for the most part, that these characters should be handed over to the criminal court, that there's no case. So rule of law is a big area that needs to be considered. It's something that makes societies predictable or not. And this varies significantly from country to country, as does principles surrounding access to justice and the judicial systems of countries. Accounting systems and financial practices also vary greatly. In some Southeast Asian countries and in Central Asian countries like Russia, there are different types of accounting systems. Certainly in the Asian case, there are the internal accounts, the accounts of domestic investors, and the accounts of international investors. And this is something else that impacts on the predictability of society. Issues related to land tenure and ownership, and this is a highly contested issue at the moment. Institutions governing this area are normally weak and considered one of the deprived ministries in government, yet their role is very important for rural development. And that is where global opportunities are taking root in rural areas of countries. And although in many transitioning societies where land was given back to the people, industrialization and other forms of development have kicked up questions concerning rule of law and human rights. So for example, across Latin America, Africa, and South Asian countries, strategies of villagization appear to be on the rise, bringing communities together more tightly to substantiate the delivery of basic state services like justice, water and sanitation, education, etc. And bearing in mind that some of these areas are nomadic in nature and involve mobile communities and pastoralist communities, governments are trying to centralize these communities in order to bring development to bear. And in many cases, this involves industrialization and development of some of these regions that have been used for agrarian purposes in the past. And there's this issue has risen to the international level, and there are allegations of human rights violations which have caught the attention of the international legal system and big organizations like Human Rights Watch. So industrial policies, I've also already mentioned the difficulties in being compliant with trade regulations because of weak industrial policies and the failure to reach international trading standards. Revenue and customs policies, that's an interesting one. Some innovations have been developed by many countries and emerging markets that wish to increase their ranking on the ease of doing business global index. So and to invite foreign direct investment. So they've reduced the bureaucracy for things like granting licenses to international companies. But some governments have also been known to change the rules concerning revenue and custom practices indiscriminately. For example, Tullow Oil and Heritage discovered oil in Uganda. Heritage sold its 50% stake in the business, but were then accused of falling foul of Ugandan taxation and revenue rules. And they were taxed retrospectively for a significant amount of money. Now, this indiscriminate decision to lodge this retrospective tax was allegedly then used to fund President Museveni's re-election campaign. Funnily enough, at around the same time, Tullow Oil was bought out by a Chinese company, and Ugandan government never followed up with this retrospective tax with the Chinese, because one could argue that there's too much of an interest in that relationship and preserving that relationship. A Canadian company called First Quantum Minerals had a mining license in the Democratic Republic of Congo taken away from them and sold on to an East European oligarch-type organization. So both First Quantum and Heritage have taken these cases to the International Commercial Court of Arbitration. So they've had to rise up to the international level because of a lack of enforcement of regulatory frameworks at the national level and the regional level. So I've highlighted 5 themes for us just to debate and discuss today. Before I stop, I should just mention what we as international business leaders could do in the future to respond to some of these powerful trends. Well, first is to recognize that the biggest global opportunities are often found in middle-income states with governance challenges, real governance challenges and security challenges. But they're never called a failing state or a state in conflict because the problems are localized and they're not specific to the country as a whole. The other issue is the issue surrounding the Millennium Development Goal debate. And this MDG debate is quite important because it's coming up for renewal in 2015. And all middle-income and low-income states have MDG agenda. And this involves the promotion of education, the reduction of poverty, the reduction of female mortality rates, and others. And this really informs the national agenda of countries. And it's important for international businesses penetrating certain countries to be cognizant of this MDG agenda. And in fact, the biggest issue on the 2015 agenda is how the corporate sector, businesses, can better support the achievement of these goals. And I can already see more companies subscribing to the Global Compact as a result of this important relationship with the MDGs. And the Global Compact was set out in 1999 in Doha, and it goes beyond the corporate social responsibility debate. It sets out standards for international companies to commit to in 3 areas: human rights, the environment, and local labor standards, use of local labor. The other issue that organizations should think about and prioritize in the future is support to capacity building. Most of these recipient states and new trading partners are concerned with skill set and knowledge transfer. And the incoming companies can use this and leverage this for many different purposes where appropriate. And the last issue is knowing how these security trends and globalization trends manifest in many different ways. It's important for organizations to create a dashboard of manageable indicators that need to be monitored, and therefore for which analysis is required on an ongoing basis. And if there is a lack of in-house capacity for this analysis, then partnerships with civil society organizations and perhaps think tanks who are at the forefront of research in this area would be a very wise idea for your organization in the future. So in summary, and before I open it up to questions, I hope we have achieved the objective to discuss security as an ambiguous and evolving concept. I've also highlighted the need to understand trends, risks, and threats to international security, and international security of all types, economic, political, national, etc. I've underscored the issue that these trends need to be analyzed through multidisciplinary lenses, and the interdependent analysis of these trends to be understood. And I've highlighted 5 areas: economic liberalization, non-state systems of governance, a power of ideas and modern technology, and regulation, and offered some additional considerations for international business planning in the future. So thank you very much for your attention. I am going to turn to the questions now, and I will answer as many as I can. I've just had a pile of them passed to me. Please feel free to ask more as well while I'm answering some of them. So the first question is there any security risk model that a company planning to globalize can utilize and review to guide investment decisions? Yeah, there are some useful risk models, a number of them. In fact, countries themselves have nationalized some of these what's called risk registers. And they're the generic form of them is quite useful for companies to use for their own planning purposes. Risk analysis companies like, big leading ones like Control Risk, a London-based company that specialize in risk, have also developed their own. I don't know if my email address is available in this podcast, but anybody interested in security risk models can contact me separately, and I'm very happy to share some good links and good resources on that one. The second question is, how do I recommend that one approaches learning about market restrictions and legislations when looking for business opportunities in an economy? Yeah, there's 2 sources of information that one needs to go down for this. The OECD is a very, very good resource and knowledge platform for market restrictions and legislations of different countries. Now, their website is www.oecd.org. And you can search under country, you can search under legislation, etc., and get a tremendous amount of information from that outlet. The other area you can look at is are the websites of the regional organizations to which a country belongs, because they will subscribe, if they're a member state of that organization, they will subscribe to the regional legislation. So, for example, the ASEAN website for people doing business with Southeast Asian nations. The other avenue to pursue, of course, is to really get on the ground and hear what the real story is about how these restrictions and legislations work at the national level. And the international ICG, the International Crisis Group, puts out excellent analytical pieces that give you the real picture on the ground, and I would highly commend their analysis. They're one of the priority knowledge repositories for me, and I'm very critical about the depth of the analysis that I latch onto in this area. The next one, could you please explain GATT and OECD? Apologies, I just used the acronyms in the presentation. GATT is a general agreement on tariffs and trade. The OECD, as mentioned a moment ago, is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, large Paris-based organization. Canada is a member and chairs many influential committees on that organization at the moment, so it is one that should be on the radar of most Canadian organizations, public sector, private sector, and not-for-profit sector. In at-risk countries, how accurate and trustworthy are estimates of economic growth? Yeah, that's an excellent question. You know, there's a really good book out there by Robinson and another author, and it's all about states and how some states fail and how some states flourish. And it talks about indicators that need to be considered alongside of traditional economic indicators. So one thing that they say, which I find really compelling, is that countries are divided amongst inclusive economies and extractive economies. So if you see great potential in a country and quite promising growth rates, but there are signs that show that that country is an extractive economy, then the risk factor goes up. If the country is an inclusive economy, then domestic investment is on the rise, as well as foreign direct investment. And one would argue, I mentioned Ethiopia a couple of times in the presentation, but this is a classic case of an inclusive economy. You can see levels of domestic investment really on the rise, and the return of diaspora from all across the world to Ethiopia, because there's a real belief across Ethiopian society that it is going to be economically prosperous in the future. They have confidence in their own country. Other countries that are extractive in nature will suffer from extraction of resources that are coming by way of economic growth, but sucked out by the political elite with wider international reach and interest. So they're trustworthy to a certain extent, but they need to be considered alongside of other indicators. And other indicators that fall outside of the economic area. And I can say another good indicator is social capital. How strong is social capital of society? If it's not strong, that is a big risk to economic growth. So I guess the overall recommendation here is to be multidisciplinary about your understanding of prospects for economic growth. Given your vast global experience, where would you rank Canada in terms of security, privacy, compliance, regulation? Well, despite leaving Canada when I was 22, 23, albeit coming back very often, and delighted to be back at Queen's now, I would rank Canada as one of the most secure countries in the world, very easily, hands down. You can even see now with the big telecommunications debate in the press and the bids for buyouts and the efforts to develop Alberta's oil sands, et cetera, to guard against dependency on foreign oil, et cetera. That's Canada, despite the fact that I've always been a bit critical about its lack of national security framework and national security posture and national security strategy, policy, there just hasn't been any, it really has the enablers in place to promote national security. And I think it's much more compliant than a lot of its like-minded friends and allies, let's just say. Right, the last question I might need some further clarification on. Can you elaborate on the evolution of FATCA and how it pertains to other countries implementing similar laws? Could the person asking the question just come up on the chat room and explain what they mean by the acronym? Let's see, I think I have gone through, I think there was one that I bypassed as well. We've recently seen details about American surveillance of online communications, particularly those of foreign nationals. Does retaliatory surveillance pose a risk to confidential communication by North American businesses doing business overseas. Does retaliatory surveillance or risk of coming? Well, I guess this falls into the cybersecurity field, of which I am not an expert, but I have colleagues working in this area, and I would be very happy to follow up with them. I could give you a bland and fairly uncompelling response to that question, but I think I will invite you to contact me directly, and I will put you in contact with my cybersecurity and forensic security colleagues. I hope that's satisfactory. Okay, so we've had clarification on the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, and I would also ask you if I could come back to you on that one as well. My knowledge is iffy in this area, so let me just liaise with colleagues on this and come back to that question, and I'd ask you to give me leave on that. So thank you very much. That's a wrap. I was delighted to speak with you today. I hope you took something home from that, and I hope there was something for every representative across different sectoral groups. I hope to hear from you soon. Bye.
All right, thanks for joining us today, and that was a very insightful and informative session. As I mentioned earlier at the beginning, we have recorded the session, and we'll be sending out an email to everyone who registered for the event. But because you're here, I'll give you the cribs notes. You can probably head on over to qsbinsight.com probably by the end of the week, and the recording will be available there as well. Thank you for your attendance, and as a reminder, if you want to be invited to future sessions, please subscribe at qsb.ca/webinars. I hope you have a great rest of the afternoon, and that's all for this month in Queens. Thank you.